to Integration Explained, Salesforce and HubSpot. I'm going to start off with a little bit of an introduction of myself. I know some of the folks in our audience already know me, and Lisa, of course, but we, Lisa and I, are Hubcap Solutions. We're a two-person HubSpot consulting firm based in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And our niche is that we focus on mid-sized organizations and helping them realize their full investment in HubSpot. Generally that's, if you've got a sales team, less than 100, if you've got a marketing team of less than 10, and you just need a partner to expand your HubSpot capabilities, whether that's with hands-on or whether that's something a little bit more strategic. That is the role we typically fill. And the reason I'm doing the session today, which is all about the HubSpot or the Salesforce integration, is because, frankly, that's something that I find myself helping a lot of companies with, because it's awesome, but it is also confusing and has a bunch of little subtleties that are easy to not necessarily get wrong, but to not get as right as you could. So today, we're going to talk about aligning your HubSpot and Salesforce teams, kind of that, just like, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but just kind of outlining the importance of, that big picture alignment, not just technological alignment. Going to go through a really quick note on installing the Salesforce and HubSpot integration. What can you sync with it in terms of what kind of records can go back and forth, and what does that look like? How do you choose what syncs? So how do you control the records that are going back and forth as part of that sync? And then common sync help issues, including duplicates. And then, just kind of a quick hit of pro tips that I have at the end. Quick note, I do have a demo account open. And if something strikes my fancy, I will pop in and show something inside the platform. But we are going to be looking mostly at slides today, just for time's sake, so that I don't get pulled down a rabbit hole of clicking. And we are going to be looking at things just from the HubSpot side of things. Again, I am significantly less of a Salesforce expert than I am of a HubSpot expert. And again, just to allow time for questions at the end, I can get pulled into the Salesforce screens just as easily as I can get pulled into the HubSpot screens. So with that, let's jump into the meat of today's presentation. Salesforce and HubSpot alignment. So what I've got here is just kind of a rough hierarchy of what that looks like. Because aligning really any systems, but particularly Salesforce and HubSpot, is a technical challenge, but it is more than a technical challenge. And one of the most foundational things that people don't set themselves up for success for when talking about the Salesforce and the HubSpot integration is, what does leadership want out of that integration? Are we taking an approach of, we want the systems to perfectly mirror each other, so everything should be 100% accurate? Are we using it as HubSpot is strictly kind of our marketing foyer for what's going to eventually arrive in Salesforce, so that it's okay if there's more records in HubSpot than there are in Salesforce, because some of those HubSpot records, haven't yet or might never be qualified. So that's kind of a baked in inherent difference within the system. Again, stuff as simple of, if you have an SDR team or any kind of initial, agent that kind of validates leads, are they doing that in HubSpot? Are they doing that in Salesforce? Is it important for you to see deals and revenue in HubSpot, even if you're not going to be managing those deals and revenue in HubSpot? So that's just an example of some of the questions that we can get into, which I've actually jumped ahead because my next slide is all about questions. But understanding what the output or what the objective of integrating the systems is going to inform how your admins on either side, kind of structure things, how that system actually gets integrated, and then how your users use it on a day-to-day basis. And I do want to draw attention to the fact of my two gear brains here of two admins. You might find a unicorn who is both a HubSpot expert and a Salesforce expert. Um, More commonly, you're going to have one dedicated admin or admin team on one side and one dedicated admin on the other side. Sometimes those are both internal. Sometimes those are both consultants. Sometimes that's an internal admin for one system and an external admin for another system. Just from my experience, I don't know why, but it seems more common that there's an internal Salesforce admin and then an external HubSpot. I think because most places that end up using Salesforce seem to adopt HubSpot later in their life cycle. But again, that's just anecdotal. So, how do you go about kind of getting to that alignment? Now, this is not all of the questions, but this is just some questions to kind of, show you what we typically ask and the things that people typically haven't considered when they're deciding to go with, integrate HubSpot and Salesforce. So for the sales team, where does the sales team track their daily activity? And this is as much an expectation setting as it is, a practical reality of, if they're doing it in Salesforce, the natural next question is, do we need to see those in HubSpot for any kind of reporting or marketing automation? Which system do we want to report on revenue from? Because HubSpot and Salesforce, they handle campaigns and attribution a little bit differently. So if we know that the sales team or the leadership is going to be looking at a revenue report from Salesforce, we might structure things a little bit differently than if we know the primary revenue reporting system is going to be HubSpot. So again, starting to answer some of the questions like this sets us up to set the integration up to deliver those outputs. And then for the marketing team, what kinds of emails are we sending? Is it all one-to-one or, bulk marketing email that we couldn't be sending from any other systems, just HubSpot? Or are we planning to send some of those automated one-to-one cold outreach emails, which, hey, there might be other tools in our toolkit, whether it's Salesforce, whether it's Outreach, whether it's Yesware, Apollo.io, that, might be doing that as well. This is a really important one. How are we planning to hand those leads off to the sales team? Is this something that, we're going to notify the sales team with a ping from HubSpot every time a certain form gets submitted? Or is this more likely, we're going to send only MQLs over to Salesforce, and then Salesforce is going to handle notifying the sales team that they've got a new lead on their desk? So knowing what we want that handoff process to look like really does, shape what the system is going to look like, because often the objective of integrating HubSpot and Salesforce is to capture a lead in HubSpot, qualify it in some way, and then put it into the hands of a sales team that's working out of Salesforce. So the entire purpose of the integration is that handoff. So knowing what we want that handoff to look like is a really foundational thing to get figured out. So, oh, I thought I had a. Anyway, so that takes care of our kind of high level alignment. So basically, know what your leadership wants out of the integration, dig into some of the day-to-day stuff on how the sales team and how the marketing team is actually going to be using the system, what you want that handoff from one team to the other to look like, and that will really set you up to shape that integration. So now I'm going to pivot into the more practical side of things, and we're going to talk about installing the Salesforce integration. This isn't something that I'm going to run through in detail because there is a really good step-by-step guide on the HubSpot side of things. Really what I want to cover here is what you need to make this happen. So if you don't have the Salesforce integration yet, you need HubSpot Pro or higher to use the Salesforce integration at all. If you're currently on Starter, Or if you're just not a HubSpot user yet, who's wondering what you're going to have to buy to use the Salesforce integration, you need a tier of HubSpot Pro or higher. That can be marketing, that can be service, that can be sales. Doesn't matter which Pro tier you have, but you need a Pro tier in HubSpot. You also are going to need access to both Salesforce and HubSpot, because am I going to get into this? Yeah, here we go. You are going to need to do something to install something called an installed package inside your HubSpot, inside your Salesforce account. And that's why you need to be a Salesforce system admin or be assigned the HubSpot integration permission set. So for the Salesforce side of things, again, Salesforce Edition with API access or a Salesforce Pro tier, and whoever's doing this integration needs to have that system admin or that HubSpot integration permission set in Salesforce. So this is why, again, going back to that whole idea of having two admins, generally speaking, I'll install this on a working call with the Salesforce administrator of whoever we're installing. Okay. Actually, let's pull this one up really quick right here, because there was something I wanted to show off. Yeah, so you can find the integration itself if you just go into the App Store or in the HubSpot app marketplace and then search Salesforce. You can see it's already installed in this environment. And then it is one of the more common and consistently installed. You can see here's all the integrations back.
Cody,
yes?
Sorry, we're still seeing the slideshow.
Oh, sorry, right. I forgot that I was sharing my window. Thank you. There we go. Perfect. So I'll recap that one. So if we go to the app marketplace, under apps, we're in HubSpot right now. If we go under the app marketplace apps, Salesforce, and if you hadn't installed it yet, you would just click this install app, and it's going to take you through this process. So again, it breaks down all the same requirements that I just broke down. It's going to ask you, hey, do you want to log into, or you're going to have to log into Salesforce. You're going to have to go through this package install process. So again, generally speaking, what I'm doing is, to get started with this, I'll invite my Salesforce admin into the HubSpot account, and then we'll just hop on a working call. I'll get the Salesforce admin to log in to HubSpot. Then they'll actually be the one that goes to the app marketplace, clicks install app, and then runs through the HubSpot integration installation process. Just because, frankly, doing HubSpot Salesforce installed package installs is not my forte. So they run through, and there is, in every instance that I have installed, there is basically a go with the default installation setup. Like, they're going to ask you if you want to do custom or if you want to go default. I've never messed around with going with anything other than default, and I've never run into any issues. So again, your HubSpot or your Salesforce admin might want to dive in and review things in more detail. But in my experience, 90-95% of use cases, going with the default installation, works just fine for folks. So let's jump back to perfect. All right. So once you get it installed, there's only one other consideration that I want to touch on, which is there's something called the Visual Force module. So this is the Add HubSpot embed, or sorry, it's now called the HubSpot embed. It used to be called the Visual Force module. But you have the option to actually add a window to your Salesforce record layout that is essentially a preview of what's going on in HubSpot. So, just like any other tab that you could add to a Salesforce layout, you can end up with this HubSpot tab embedded in, which is just a summary of the activity history of what that contact has done. Some people choose to add this, some people don't. I find it's generally less useful if your team doesn't know what's going on in HubSpot. Like if I'm a sales rep, I can see, oh, Donald Duck here, opened the email. What did you think? If I don't know what's in that email or what the context of that email being sent out was, it doesn't add a ton of value to me as a sales rep. I could absolutely click through and click into HubSpot and learn a little bit more about that email, but just as like a list of here's the things that are happening. It also, I find that, it's a little bit less useful than people tend to think it's going to be initially. So feel free. It's a worthwhile experiment and it's a worthwhile conversation to have with your users, but don't think it's a necessary thing to go with. Next, okay, here's the data sync settings, recommended setup, advanced setup. I already talked about that quickly. So once you've got the setup complete, that's when we get into actually looking at the integration for, within HubSpot. Now, what we're going to end up with, I'm going to hop back to I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm going to hop back to my actual Salesforce integration and show you guys this so we're all on the same page. Integration is perfect. So within your HubSpot account, again, you just go the settings gear to bring up the settings down the side, and then you go integrations, connected apps. Once you've finished the setup, you're going to end up with an installed app for Salesforce. If you give it a click, here's what we're going to look at. I want to call quick attention to this because this is going to become consequential a little bit later. That's your integration user. So that is generally speaking, those are the credentials that you use to log into Salesforce while you were conducting the installation of the integration. So, this was done by Salesforce admin in this account, Ernie. So we're just connected through his credentials. I do generally recommend, this is another reason why, if the Salesforce admin is an internal user, and in my case, I'm an external user, I always also try to encourage people to say, use an internal user as your integration user. It's not to say that internal people never move on, but frankly, they move on less than a consultant, might. So going with an internal user, somebody whose credentials you can track down if they leave or if something changes, generally the way to go about it. But once you've got the Salesforce integration installed, this is what you'll end up looking at. You end up with basically a tab for each object that can sync. You end up with a quick little overview of the sync health. And if you ever need to just turn it off whole hog, even if it's just to pause it, you can do that via this toggle up here. So for some reason, something's gone awry, or you want to install the integration and then review it, set things up before actually turning it on, that's a valid approach as well. You can also go in here, you can connect to a different user. So if you ever need to change your integration user, that's fine. Same thing with a different sandbox. So you can change the user here if you ever need to, and you can turn off the entire integration right here. All right. So let's jump back to the presentation here and talk a little bit more high level before we get into the nitty-gritty. So what can you sync with the HubSpot integration? These are all of the things that you can sync. Contacts, I'm going to draw attention to, is not optional. Like when you turn on the Salesforce integration with HubSpot, you will be syncing contacts in some capacity. There's no option to not sync contacts. An important thing, and this is something I will stress on some later slides, is that when you sync contacts to HubSpot or to and from HubSpot, you are actually syncing both Salesforce contacts and Salesforce leads. Both Salesforce leads and Salesforce contacts sync to HubSpot contacts. I've got a whole breakdown of this on my next slide, but super important to get your head around this to begin with. Any record, basically any object in Salesforce that represents an individual person, whether that is a lead or whether that is a contact, syncs to a HubSpot contact. Keep that in mind when we move to the next slide. Companies, Salesforce accounts, you can turn that on and off. Deals, they sync to Salesforce opportunities, turn it on and off. Tickets, they sync with Salesforce cases. Again, you can have that be on or off. Activities, sync to Salesforce tasks. And then you do have custom objects. So if you do have any custom objects in HubSpot or Salesforce, you can sync them back and forth, but that is only available at enterprise. So if you're using the pro level, you're restricted to these kind of 5, core objects. So we're now going to talk about the syncing of a Salesforce contact, a HubSpot contact to Salesforce. So this simple flowchart assumes one thing, that we have created a new contact in HubSpot. So, and keep in mind, HubSpot contacts are HubSpot contacts. There is, it doesn't matter what the lifecycle stage is. It doesn't matter whether they're linked to a company or not. It doesn't matter whether they've been called an MQ or an MQL or not. There is one HubSpot contact per email address, one HubSpot contact for each person in your database. So that person it's time for that person to sync to Salesforce. We'll talk about that process more in a bit, but this is going to be, it's time for them to sync to Salesforce. The integration is going to ask one question when it wants to create that person for the first time. It is going to say, does a Salesforce contact already exist? And it's going to answer this question by looking for an email address. It's going to say our HubSpot contact, which has cody@companyabc.com. Is there already a contact in Salesforce that has cody@abccompany.com? If yes, it's going to link to that existing contact. It's basically going to say, yep, based on an email address match, I recognize this person. If it doesn't, we can configure the integration to say, if there is no match, create that person as a new Salesforce lead. So, our HubSpot contact, does a Salesforce contact already exist? No. Okay, let's create a Salesforce lead. But Salesforce leads aren't supposed to be permanent objects. They're eventually supposed to get converted, ideally, into contacts. So what happens in that situation? So boom, we've crafted someone in HubSpot. They didn't already exist in Salesforce. They've been created as a Salesforce lead, and then we've converted them into a Salesforce contact. What happens then? The integration starts to care about that contact. So each HubSpot contact will only ever sync to one other record in Salesforce. If only a lead exists, it will sync with the lead. If a lead and a contact exist with the same email address as a HubSpot contact, HubSpot will always care about the contact and stop paying attention to the lead. So this is important because let's say you're capturing how did you hear about us on your Salesforce leads, but you're not capturing how did you hear about us on your Salesforce contacts. Once this integration switches to caring about the Salesforce contact rather than the Salesforce lead, you're not going to pull any updates to that lead into the contact. You could go in and you could force edit that person's how did you hear about us. And because HubSpot doesn't care about that lead anymore, that update's not going to pass back to HubSpot. So this is a really common point of confusion for people is, oh, why is this data that was on my lead not on my contact anymore? Or why are these updates that I'm making to my lead not on my contact anymore? Or why did this person who submitted my demo form not create a lead? And it's like, well, because that's the second time that that person has submitted your demo form and they already exist as a contact in Salesforce. So the integration isn't going to create another lead because as long as a Salesforce contact with the same email address already exists, HubSpot only cares about the contact, not leads, and it's not going to create additional leads. So because you have to sync contacts and because this can be such a confusing situation for folks, I want to spend a bunch of time kind of breaking that one down. So, Lisa, any questions in the chat about that?
No questions have turned up in the chat yet.
Awesome. Okay. So let's look at, we know what objects we can sync. So when you sync, for regardless which object you set up or which object you're setting up, they all have one-to-one, they all have their own field mappings. So right now I'm looking at contact field mappings. So this is just a list of all of the properties that you could sync. When you install the integration the first time, the integration is basically going to say, hey, what are all of the properties you have available in Salesforce? And then it's going to create corresponding properties in HubSpot for all of those. With the exception of any of these mapping type standards. So city is always going to map to city when you install the Salesforce integration. Any of these custom ones like communication consent castle, business unit, these were all created when we installed the integration. As you add new properties after installing the integration, you do have to add mappings. So if I were to add favorite ice cream flavor to my HubSpot forms, and I wanted that to map over to my Salesforce records, I would have to come in and I would go add new field mapping, and I would map favorite ice cream flavor in HubSpot to a newly created field I would ask my Salesforce admin to create called favorite ice cream flavor. Again, this is another place that people often fall down when it comes to maintaining the Salesforce and HubSpot integration is the Salesforce team will create a new field that they start using, and then, or the HubSpot team, and then one of those other teams will ask, be like, hey, can we do a filter based on favorite ice cream flavor? But nobody ever told the HubSpot team or the Salesforce team that that field exists, so it never got mapped, so that information just isn't in either system. Now, when you add the field mapping, you do have the ability to say, hey, go out and update all of the records that have that information. So if you have forgotten to map something, it's not the biggest issue in the world. You can pull that data in retroactively, relatively simply. Now, the other thing that I'm going to call attention to on this screen is that you can set up how you want, which system you want to have primacy in terms of the information. So there's basically three sync behaviors. There's two-way, which is down here in the castle communication consent, which is both systems can update the other and it's just going to take whoever's the most recent change was. You can go prefer Salesforce, which is basically prefer Salesforce unless blank. So if HubSpot, if we added a city to a contact and Salesforce didn't already have a city value, it would update, push Winnipeg to the blank, and then the Salesforce property would become Winnipeg. You can also always use Salesforce, which is we will reject any changes that HubSpot tries to make. So if the city was blank, but HubSpot gave us a city, and then we tried to push that city to fill in the blank, HubSpot or Salesforce would say, nope, this is blank for a reason, make it blank in HubSpot as well. So this is another place where sometimes people will see strange behavior, like, oh, I updated the person's job title, or that person updated their job title on a form. And then HubSpot changed that value, tried to push that value to Salesforce, and then Salesforce rejected the change and changed it back to what it was before the form submission. That's a situation where it's preferring Salesforce. It's basically saying, oh, you've told me to prefer Salesforce when it comes to job title, so I'm going to reject any HubSpot changes. So again, you can change these, individually, basically say, hey, yep, change the behavior for specific fields. You can delete mappings. So if there's something that's mapped where you're like, that doesn't need to stay in sync, you can absolutely delete any one of these mapped fields other than the standard ones. Or, as you add new properties, you can add new sync relationships between those fields as well. Activities, they sync a little bit weird. It's not a true bi-directional sync right now. There's a toggle under the activities tab where you can turn it on to say automatically create a task in HubSpot when a task is created in Salesforce. So this is basically saying I want to push my Salesforce activities into my HubSpot timeline. If you just toggle that switch on, kind of set it and forget it. But you can also do this timeline sync here, which is on by default. So if you install the integration, you might start noticing in your Salesforce activity timeline, things usually by default, it's form submissions and email clicks, which is ticked on. But what's going to happen is because this timeline sync activity is on, anytime a contact submits a form in HubSpot, if that contact is syncing with Salesforce, it's going to create a task in that activity timeline that says form submitted, name of form. If you don't want that to happen, you can just run down this list and untick the sync checkbox, and then HubSpot won't create any of those kind of, tasks in your HubSpot or in your Salesforce activity history. And there is a beta feature happening right now to make activity syncing, calls, meetings, tasks, emails, to make those things sync truly bi-directionally. But I've installed it in a couple of accounts, and it has several issues. I think they're going to get it ironed out within the next 3 to 4 months. So if you're looking at this as a way of saying, hey, I'd like to see exactly what's happening with my sales reps communication back and forth and have it be the same in Salesforce and HubSpot, that is coming, but that isn't here today in a way that I would trust. So I didn't show off anything specifically related to the deals, accounts, or tickets, only because when it comes to their sync relationship, it's exactly the same as contacts. Like you basically have a mapping behavior or a mapping document in Salesforce in the integration, which you fill out to control which information goes back and forth. The only real difference is like I said at the beginning, is that you can toggle or accounts, deals, and tickets start as not syncing by default. So when you install your HubSpot in Salesforce integration, by default, you will start syncing contacts, but you would have to go in and choose to turn on the sync for companies, deals, and tickets if you want them. They will not be on by default. And I know sometimes that creates headaches for people if they're like, oh, great, it's installed. And then 2 weeks later, they come back and they're like, oh, wait, why aren't my deals in HubSpot? Well, because you have to go choose to turn that feature on. Well, contacts happen automatically. So controlling what syncs to, between the two systems. When it comes to contacts, any contact with a valid email address will sync from Salesforce to HubSpot. Full stop. There is no, at least in using the default setup, there is no way to say, I only want to sync people who are contact type prospect, for example, or I only want to sync contacts that are located in North America from HubSpot, from Salesforce to HubSpot. If a person has a valid email address, they are eligible to sync into HubSpot. Now, that doesn't mean that they will sync, that the entire database is going to sync immediately. Like if we look at the note here down at the bottom, records do not sync immediately when the sync is activated. Sync occurs when records are created, updated, or imported. So if you have 100,000 people in your Salesforce account that have email addresses, and you turn on the HubSpot integration, that doesn't mean that 5 minutes later you're going to have an extra 100,000 people in your HubSpot database. What that means is that anybody that gets created or updated after that sync is turned on will then show up in HubSpot. Sometimes, on a day-to-day basis, this usually means that you're going to get, a handful of people trickling into HubSpot via the Salesforce integration. But let's say that, you decided to, your team was like, hey, we've got to do a bulk update to set the state or the province or the GPS coordinates of every single contact in our Salesforce database. Well, if the sync is on, you would have just updated every record in your Salesforce database, which would cause all of those records to push down to HubSpot. So there's a lot of subtlety around how you go about managing that, but I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that there is no control over which contacts with emails sync from Salesforce to HubSpot. Going from HubSpot to Salesforce, completely different matter. You can control who goes to Salesforce based on something called an inclusion list. That is a list that you set up with specific criteria to say, I only want these contacts from HubSpot to go into my Salesforce account. The reason that it works one way and not the other is because HubSpot, generally speaking, is capturing leads. HubSpot is assuming that you're going to want to qualify your leads in some way before you send them to Salesforce. So they're letting you set up an inclusion list to say, oh, here are the qualified people. Only push them to Salesforce. You can choose to go without an inclusion list, which would mean that everybody from HubSpot is eligible to sync to Salesforce, but you can choose to control who syncs from HubSpot to Salesforce based on really any criteria that you can think of. For the other side of things, all eligible records will sync from HubSpot to Salesforce and vice versa. There's so deals, tickets, companies, they all work exactly the same as contacts in terms of that on the Salesforce side. Anytime you create a company in HubSpot or create a deal in HubSpot, it's going to try to sync to Salesforce. Anytime you create a ticket in Salesforce or a case in Salesforce, it's going to try to sync to HubSpot. I'm going to make myself a liar now because there is a way that is not officially supported by HubSpot. So I don't encourage people to go down this route, but it's something called selective sync. And this goes back to our integration user. So the only records that are eligible to sync from Salesforce to HubSpot are the records that your integration user can see. So if you were to restrict your permissions of your integration user to say, I only want that user to be able to see Salesforce records that are located in North America, those are the only records that would be eligible to sync. I'm not going to go into how this usually gets done because it involves permission sets and sharing rules and a bunch of Salesforce stuff that I'm not super well versed in. But I do just want everybody to know that there is a way to only allow a certain subset of Salesforce records to be visible to HubSpot, but it does involve manipulating the permissions of the user in Salesforce that you're using to run the sync, basically your integration user. So there is a lot of documentation on selective sync. It is just weird because HubSpot doesn't officially support it. So if you did run into any issues and you were using selective sync, HubSpot would basically be like, we can't help you. You're going to have to go talk to your Salesforce admin. All right. So here's, within the actual app, here's where you basically say, hey, and here's it breaks down valid emails, consent to subput. Here's the inclusion list. Here's the inclusion list that we have that we were using in this demo account. So I'm basically saying, if you already have a Salesforce ID, so basically if you've originated from Salesforce, you're eligible to make updates back to Salesforce. And then I use a property called sync to Salesforce is any of yes, which I set via workflow. So if somebody has, say, submitted a contact us form or their lead score has crossed a certain threshold, I just have a workflow that says set sync to Salesforce to yes. And then those folks are eligible to sync. Oftentimes, this will be determined by lifecycle stage. This demo account just isn't using lifecycle stage as that control mechanism. So in this situation, even though I've got 6,000 or so contacts in the entire database, only 1,300 of them are eligible to sync to Salesforce because that's what my inclusion list is set up to allow.
Hey, Cody, before you move on, we have a quick question in the chat there about the sync and marketing contacts. Would you mind taking a look?
Absolutely. Let's just hop on back. Can we integrate everyone from Salesforce to HubSpot, but only some of them marked yes? Absolutely. 100%. By default, any contact that comes from Salesforce comes across as a non-marketing contact. So if you have a set of workflows set up to say people who meet certain criteria, certain geographies, certain products, certain customer types, if you have something set up to say that already that people that meet those criteria should become marketing contacts, then that logic will just apply for anybody that gets synced over. If you don't, and that's something that you can set up to say, hey, if original source is any of Salesforce and contact type equals customer set to marketing contact, you can definitely build those workflows if that's something that can happen consistently. Or feel free, sync people over and then do a bulk sync and then just manually edit those people into marketing contacts. So yeah, great question, Maureen, because that is something that a lot of people hesitate about doing the integration because they're like, well, I've only got 25,000 marketing contacts in HubSpot, but I have 1 million contacts in Salesforce. I don't want to drive up my costs. You don't have to. And that actually dovetails really nicely with this bulk syncing records from Salesforce. Because as I said earlier, when you turn on the sync, it doesn't automatically pull everybody across. So, but at the same time, I encourage people not to just let it trickle in, because then you inevitably get questions of, oh, why isn't this person in HubSpot yet? When somebody goes to build a marketing list, and like, oh, it's just because that person hasn't been edited yet, or whatever. So I often will turn on the sync and then fairly immediately use an import, which if you go in HubSpot, no, I'm going to resist the urge. Actually, no, I am going to stop sharing. I'm going to share this real quick. There we go. If you go into your import or your add data button, depending on whether HubSpot has updated that yet for you, you click import and you go import a file. You can go objects from an app, and that'll allow you to pull records directly from Salesforce. So you could say, hey, I've turned on the sync rather than letting everybody match or you trickle over. I can just go in, I can do an import, I can add filters to those, and I can filter over a subset of records or whatever. So in my experience, this is the best way to go about pulling records into Salesforce in a controlled way. Just because any other import that you can do doesn't bring over the Salesforce contact ID or the Salesforce record ID. So, like I say, if you were to say take your accounts and do an export to a CSV from HubSpot or from Salesforce and then import that to HubSpot, there's a very real possibility that when some of those records sync naturally, because one of them got updated, they might not match, because we're going to get into the matching rules in just a second. But using this bulk import objects from app ensures that the record that gets pulled from Salesforce also gets populated with the correct object ID from Salesforce, which is what the integration uses to keep those records in sync. So that's basically the sync rules. Actually, now I want to talk a little bit more about the sync rules, about some of the other objects like companies. So like I said, you can choose to sync companies or not, or you can choose to sync deals, activities, tickets or not. Same thing when they are manually imported or when the records get updated and they sync according to whatever rules you've set up in the sync mapping. But companies, when it comes to syncing companies from HubSpot to Salesforce, if you choose to, there's a couple things to keep in mind. Companies that are not associated to any contacts in HubSpot, so say you just go out and you scrape a list of companies off the internet and you load them in to be targets of your marketing in HubSpot. If the company doesn't have a contact associated with it in HubSpot, it's not going to sync to Salesforce. Keep in mind, that is not the case for syncing from Salesforce to HubSpot. The Salesforce, if you have an orphan company in Salesforce, you will end up with an orphan company in HubSpot. It's just that HubSpot won't push orphan companies up to Salesforce. If everybody at a company is a Salesforce lead, not a Salesforce contact, it's not going to push the company. And if maybe you have a company where it does have contacts associated with it in HubSpot, but none of those contacts are on your inclusion list, that'll also prevent the company from syncing. Deals, the one thing I want to talk about on deals is that record types in Salesforce. So if you're using the opportunity record type to have different pipeline or different processes or different views of your Salesforce opportunities, when you sync them to HubSpot, those are going to show up as different pipelines in HubSpot. So this Salesforce sales pipeline, Salesforce e-commerce, those are different types, different opportunity record types in Salesforce that are being reflected as separate pipelines in HubSpot. Now, as you see in this snip, you can have pipelines in HubSpot that aren't connected to your Salesforce record types, but by default, each record type gets its own pipeline. Contact rules, associations. So when you're looking at a deal in HubSpot to say how many records are associated with it, it's only going to care about Salesforce contact rules. So in this case, when this deal or this opportunity syncs to HubSpot as a deal, you're going to end up with Alan and Lang as the associated contacts in HubSpot. If you had a field, like a property that was like primary contact, and you could add people into that field under the details section, that's not going to show up as an association once that record hits HubSpot. So the people that end up as your associated contacts are the people that are attached as contact roles. This sometimes creates a problem for folks because if your organization isn't using contact roles, but wants to be able to know which HubSpot people are attached to which opportunities and deals, if you're missing this information, you're going to be missing that information on the HubSpot side as well. Okay, I know I've run longer than anticipated. So some quick notes on sync health troubleshooting. We looked at it when we looked at the integration screen. There is a sync health dashboard, which is going to show you how many records are affected by any given sync error. So pick lists, this is just going to be saying, hey, 203 people have values that don't match across pick lists. Duplicates, we've got 108 folks that have potential duplicate issues. If you click on any one of these tiles, it's going to show you the specific records that it's affecting. It's also going to show you when it detected that error. So you can go through and troubleshoot. And if you say, oh, there's a property value error here from 2 years ago, you can actually dismiss that error without having to fix it. But this is basically your quick, how many issues am I having? How many records is it affecting? I've never seen a sync that doesn't have at least a few sync errors. But if you've got, if you're at less than 1% of your records having some kind of issue, you're in a pretty good spot. So in this case, because we've got a 9,000 person database with about 500 records having potential errors, I'm like, yeah, there's some things that I'm going to want to squash, but it's also not a 5-alarm fire. Common sync errors. One of the most common is a missing value in a HubSpot or Salesforce pick list. And this just happens because, the HubSpot team adds a new customer type and forgets to tell the Salesforce admin to add it to the corresponding pick list on Salesforce. That's going to throw an error, but it's not going to prevent the record from syncing. It's just going to say, hey, for this particular field, you have, there's a missing value. Go ahead and add it. Mismatched users. This is another really common one. If you will be syncing record ownership back because that's a standard part of the sync. But say my name, was Mike, Mike Pearson in Salesforce. But when I added myself to HubSpot, I put my name as Michael Pearson. For the sync, those aren't the same user. So in order for record ownership to map correctly between Salesforce and HubSpot, the first and last names have to match exactly. And the user has to be active in Salesforce. That's another thing. But most commonly, if somebody's like, oh, Steve's, I'm not seeing Steve's record ownership correctly in HubSpot, or I'm having trouble setting records to be owned by Steve when I send them to Salesforce, double check and make sure that, it's not Steve in one system and Steven in another system. And then one of my last common ones is if there's a required field, and this usually affects HubSpot or Salesforce more than HubSpot, but say you make it required that somebody has to have a city. in Salesforce. You're like, nope, we only accept people or companies that have a city value. But then maybe you import a list of users from a list of companies or contacts from into HubSpot that don't have cities. When it tries to push that record to Salesforce, it's going to say, nope, this record is missing a required value, so we're not going to let you create it. So if you are not seeing records that you expect to see getting created in Salesforce, double check to make sure that those records have all of the required values that Salesforce demands before it lets a record get created. Duplicate management. Salesforce leads and contacts deduplicate by email address. That is it. Like there are, you can have duplicate detection rules in Salesforce that maybe do add some secondary layers to this, but by default, they do all their matching between contacts and leads by email address. If you have multiple records in Salesforce that have the same email address, because you can do that, you could have 3 versions of, mike@abccompany.com in Salesforce. The HubSpot integration will sync with whichever one of those records was updated most recently. So HubSpot's going to say, yep, I see a record. I actually see 3 records that have that email address. Oh, this one was updated yesterday. That's the one that I'm going to care about. If another one gets updated, or if a different one gets updated tomorrow, HubSpot is going to shift its syncing to that newest updated record. So if that newest record is missing some information that an earlier record had, HubSpot's going to say, oh, nope, I'm going to take the values from the most recently updated records. So if you want to save yourself some headache, try not to have duplicate email addresses on your contacts and leads in Salesforce. Salesforce companies. Duplicate Salesforce companies is one of the most common issues that I run into when people are syncing Salesforce and HubSpot. The truth is, and that is because HubSpot and Salesforce deduplicate their the account and the company object based on associations. Basically, what that's saying is that if the company in HubSpot is called Hubcap Solutions and only has Cody associated with it, but you have a company in Salesforce called Hubcap Solutions that has Cody and Lisa associated with it, when that record tries to sync, even if the names match exactly, and this is the first time it's syncing, it's going to say, oh, I'm going to deduplicate by saying, I'm going to look for Hubcap Solutions with Cody Pearson and Lisa Latour. Oh, the Hubcap Solutions in HubSpot only has Cody Pearson. Well, must not be the same company because this company doesn't have Lisa, and then it's going to create a duplicate of that company. So I know we're past time, so I'm not going to drill into this one, but if you guys are running into issues with syncing companies between Salesforce and HubSpot, that is very common. There are solutions. Hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm happy to give you a little bit more of a deep dive into that. You can't merge companies in HubSpot when it comes to once the Salesforce integration is installed. So in this instance, Amer Sports and Amer Sports Company, or Quality Dining and Quality Dining. Normally, we could merge those 2 companies in HubSpot to keep our database clean. Unfortunately, once you've got the Salesforce integration installed, you can't merge companies. I'm not going to pretend to understand why exactly that's the case, but it is a reality that we have to we have to deal with. And it is one of the reasons why duplicate companies is such an issue, is because once they get there, we have limited options of what we can do about them other than just deleting them. There are a couple of pro tips that I'm going to send everybody the deck. So you're going to be able to see these. I'm going to say, yeah, pop to the end, take a look at them. They're not deep, but they are handy. And feel free to shoot me any questions that you guys might have about any of this, because I know I brushed through some pretty heavy stuff, and there is a lot of subtlety into how that gets handled. All right. John, Maureen, thank you so much. Thank you guys for sticking with me past the hour. I truly appreciate it. I wish I had time to dive into some of your questions, but I will probably track a lot of you guys down on LinkedIn and shoot out some invites. So when I do, feel free to bounce back with some questions and get some free HubSpot knowledge out of me, because I'm more than happy to give it away. All right, gang. Thank you so much, and we will all talk soon, I am sure.